Whether you're a parent navigating myofunctional disorders or simply curious about optimizing your family's overall health, the MyoHacker podcast is your guide. Hi, I'm Karindy, a speech-language pathologist, myofunctional therapist, and a mom on a mission to bring holistic health to you and your family. Together, we'll explore whole-body connections and integrative solutions. Please subscribe and leave us a 5-star review to help other families discover this important information. Visit myohackerslp.com for free resources and guides. Quick disclaimer. The content shared in this podcast is for information and entertainment purposes only. The views and opinions expressed by the host and guests do not necessarily reflect those of the podcast or its affiliates. This podcast does not provide medical, legal, or professional advice. Always consult a professional regarding your circumstances. By listening, you agree that the host and podcast are not responsible for any actions you may take based on the information provided. Now, let's dive into today's episode. Welcome, friends, to the MyoHacker podcast. With us today, I have an incredible friend and colleague. Her name is Danielle Mitchell. I will have Danielle introduce herself and tell you all about her background, her training. I just wanted to give you a little bit of information about how we first met. I had my first patient with a genesis of the corpus callosum, I guess it was 5 years ago. And I wanted to find out more about how I could help a patient with this specific diagnosis. So I was connected to Danielle Mitchell, not in regards to what she does as an incredible counselor, dietitian, and all of her other training background, just her tools in her tool belt, she'll tell you about later. But just as a mom, that's how I was introduced to her, is how can I work with this patient that has a genesis of the corpus callosum and support them? So we became really friends just through that. And then later I had a loved one who was going through neurofeedback, and I wanted to be able to support their serotonin production. But I was like, it's in the gut. Who is doing this? Who's working on this? And that led me back to Danielle. So with that background information, Danielle, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, for those who aren't on a video, I was smiling the whole time Karindy was reflecting on that story because of just the kind of crazy, right? Like how crazy coincidence, not so much, right? Just to be connected in those ways. So, people see my credentials and they either think one of two things. One of like, do you ever sleep? Or two, like, did you not know what you wanted to be when you grew up? And so I like to start kind of from this place of like, how did I end up doing what I do? Without giving the entire backstory. I knew pretty early on, I was like one of those rare birds as a junior in high school that knew I wanted to become a dietitian and somehow wanted to work in the mental health field. And so went and did a 4-year undergrad in pre-med at A&M and a Bachelor of Nutritional Sciences, then finished at A&M, moved to Houston, did a pretty rigorous dietetic internship, which led me to then get a job at MD Anderson in the breast cancer clinic. I loved those years of clinical experience. And I loved working in a hospital. I loved working in oncology. I loved the elements of integrative oncology. And it was pretty clear to me during my time there that, again, the mental health, behavioral health aspect was so important to how I wanted to practice nutrition. I didn't want to just hand people nutrition plans, side effect plans, and wish them luck. I really wanted to dive into the understanding of how does change happen? How do people create momentum to drive the changes that really affect their health? And so during my work there, I was going to work, 60 hours a week, and then did my master's on the weekends, a master's of education in counseling. And when I finished there, that launched me into this place of, okay, I think private practice is the best way to be able to offer both services and functional nutrition to meet people in the space where maybe that's all they want. Maybe they just want to address functional nutrition, or to have clients who come to me saying like, hey, I want to engage you as a counselor, really to kind of walk through the anxiety, the depression, the trauma, the marriage and family therapy, and really then to offer the overlap of both. And so I would say there's people out there that do amazing work in functional nutrition and amazing work in clinical counseling. But again, it's rare to find someone who speaks into both of those areas, or I should say maybe has the ability and the licensure to speak into both of those areas. And so that's kind of my niche. And then fast forward, I was doing all of that work. My husband and I were told that we would never be able to have babies. And we got married, and 7 months in, I was pregnant with my first child. Again, I attribute a lot of that to kind of the functional nutrition space. And then our second born, unbeknownst to us, we had a normal, healthy pregnancy with him. He was born at 41 weeks and 5 days. There was no complication at all with his delivery. There were no signs to be said or told from the ultrasounds. But about 2 days into his little life, we had a series of events that led us to a fabulous neonatologist who said, we want to run some tests for his brain. And we found out at 48 hours old that he is missing his corpus callosum, which is the connection that Karindy and I made with that little one with agenesis of the corpus callosum. So that's my son as well, and also has multiple brain abnormalities. And so I say that part of the story as I'm talking about kind of how did I get where I am, because it's really interesting to think that everything was leading us to that place. I was already in the space of treasuring and prioritizing how the brain and nutrition are impacting each other. And then to be given the gift of a son who needed some significant work in that area, as any parent out there knows, you know your stuff. And then your child is diagnosed with something or is facing something, and then you really get to know your stuff because it's your kid. And so I was passionate about the fields of, again, neuronutrition and pediatric health. I was doing it and passionate about it long before, but it is now a calling. I mean, it is something that my husband and I both, as we started the Cognizant Group, really felt like that it does exist. There are other people doing this, but maybe it doesn't exist in this way. Maybe it's not someone who has really walked in those shoes. And so, name a therapy and we are doing it, which is, Karindy and I met through a series of other situations before then, but I am proud and happy to say that we are also clients of Karindy's, patients of Karindy's, the MyoMagic at home and myofunctional therapy. So that has opened my eyes to something I never would have known, just this overlap of neuronutrition and airway health. And so again, more of what we'll talk about today, but that's kind of the long backstory of why am I doing what I'm doing?
And I think that is something that for me has been just such a nuanced understanding application of how nutrition can impact airway. And I think for both of us, because we sort of had these areas of expertise, and it's been through coordinating care together and really nerding out. Danielle and I will go deep into the weeds because we want to understand, okay, this person has loose connective tissue. We understand that. We're seeing signs in the gut. And with this gut permeability, we're also seeing increased tonsil size. We're seeing changes throughout the pharynx, or the areas that we breathe and swallow. And so a lot of this back and forth of when we are making changes in the gut, of how this is actually improving a client's ability to breathe through their nose. And this is massive. Also, just as we're working for the individuals that are really in the airway space, how important nitric oxide is. And sometimes we have patients that even though they might be breathing through their nose, they have just genetic SNPs or mutations, which I can let you speak to, about that make it more difficult for them to actually utilize or maybe generate, you can speak to that again, the nitric oxide. And so the role of supplementation and just diet and how these things can impact that. Also anemia. We talk about this a lot when patients have difficulty with sleeping. If they have increased, I keep speaking to tonsil and adenoid size because I will say a lot of patients that have issues with that have really things that your panels can take a look at and address through care. So let's actually jump to that, because I love referring to Danielle for a specific panel that she has created with these patients in mind. So it's been through years of us referring back and forth for care, and just she started seeing, okay, there are panels that exist that help with identifying needs, but they weren't exactly the ones that we wanted. So tell us about that panel, how you created it, and what you can find out through that.
Sure thing. And I think it needs to be said from the very get-go. You and I are aligned on this. Like, I'm a believer in what we call multidisciplinary care.
Yes.
From those days early on working in a hospital, I think it's so important that people who have an expertise know how to stay in their lane and know how to refer appropriately when there is an expert that could speak to it better. And so I say that because, some people are like hearing this idea of nutrition and are like, shouldn't you just be talking about fat grams and calories and eating veggies? And that is a huge part of being a dietitian. And something I had to really start to wrap my mind around about a decade ago is how do I, with an expertise that I have, kind of push into this, what we call the functional space, knowing when to stay in my lane, right? Knowing when I need to be working with a pediatrician, a neurologist, a geneticist, a gastroenterologist. And so I say that from the get-go because it is so important that people know that a multidisciplinary team, it's how Karindy and I operate. And it's also so important with what I'm about to share in these functional assessments that we can draw. When I think about, the big focuses, if a client comes to me, it's not my style to just blanket them with really expensive testing in any and every area. We tend to hone in on if the symptom or signs are showing up that we really need to consider gut testing, then we'll do a stool test, right? If I see significant deficiencies or signs of deficiencies for micronutrients, then we probably need to do a blood test looking at vitamin and mineral sufficiencies. But one of the things that continued to pop up, and the 21 years that I've been in this field, is this idea of like, how do we capture something from what I would consider a systems approach? So when I'm putting a puzzle piece together of how I can best help an individual, there are these, big buckets that we as practitioners think about. We often think about inflammation. Internal and external inflammation. We often think about detoxification pathways. We talk and think about methylation. We want to dive into an understanding of mitochondrial health. We want to think about nutrients. And so again, a provider comes at one unique patient with all of these thoughts. And to be quite honest, to get measurements on all those things can be really labor intensive, really invasive for the patient, and really expensive. And so about 5 years ago, I was introduced to the field of nutrigenomics, and I'll speed up on the process here, but the field of nutrigenomics and genomics is really not looking at, genetics as far as like the diagnostics of you're going to have this disease or you're going to die because of this, right? There's geneticists that I trust and love for that. But this is kind of looking at the genomics of like, how do we hone in on what I consider the fault lines? I steal that from my son's neurologist. She says, hey, what we're doing is we're trying to find the fault lines in a child, like thinking about an earthquake analogy. When we find the fault lines, we're supporting the fault lines. We're never going to fix the genes per se, but we're able to identify where there may be some weaknesses so that we can come in and with using epigenetics. So epigenetics is the field of looking at diet, lifestyle, stress, sleep hygiene, appropriate supplementation, environmental toxins. How do we use those epigenetic changes to then kind of turn on, turn off. And that's a little bit of a stretch to say it like that, but to address those genes that would have these what we call polymorphisms. And so as I launched into that, one thing, as Karindy was referencing, one thing that was a little confusing to me is most of the genomic markers or testings panels that I was exposed to or utilize, people that are way smarter than me in developing these panels, I was using them, but finding myself having to kind of pick and choose for a panel. Like, we'll run this, but we're missing that, or we'll run this, we're missing that. And so for Grand Genomics, who's an Austin-based company, again, there's so many genomic testings out there that are awesome. They just happened to be one that I was familiar with, kind of had some ability to ask questions of. And so I started asking questions of, especially in the mental health field or in the neuronutrition health. I just asked, is there a way that we could have all of those panels kind of put into one? And they were so helpful, allowed me to kind of partner with them in creating, when I say creating our own panel, I did not come up with the genetics from that. Again, I'm not that brilliant. I just was a problem solver to say, this is what I think would be best for some of these clients. And there's other physicians that run similar panels. This is just one. We call it the NeuroWell Plus, because as a licensed professional counselor and as a dietitian, it is a panel that allows me to address all of those categories that I mentioned before. And we can walk through them in more detail if you want to. But in addressing those, in a non-invasive way, it's a cheek swab. So there's no blood, there's no urine. It allows us, even from infancy, to say, hey, these are the things that would be kind of a roadmap for this person over time. We're going to get a test panel back, and we're not going to do everything about everything, right? We're going to look at what is the biggest need at this time for that person, and how do we support that, again, with diet, sleep, stress management, appropriate supplementation, lifestyle. How do we address that? And it may shift in years to come. When someone's a preteen or a young adult or an adult, we may come back to that exact same panel, because by the way, it doesn't change, but we may come back to that exact same panel and say, hey, now the needs really are popping up here. And we have specific examples, that you and I can chat about or share examples of, thinking about, again, after a surgery, right? We might not have been concerned about detoxification markers before, but if a patient comes to us and says, hey, I've got to be under anesthesia for X amount of time, what do I do now? So we can utilize this panel both for longevity of wellness, and we can also utilize the panel for, I don't want to say acute, like scary, but short-term situations. So that's kind of an overview of the panel, but I'm happy to dive into more detail if you think it would be of value.
So I would love to go back to, because I think, those markers that you talked about, inflammation, mitochondrial health, all of these things, I love, as you described, the systems approach, because from an airway perspective, I'm looking at the airway system, but it's not in a vacuum. It is absolutely going to be impacted by these other systems. Some patients will have, we see red on the panel in one system, but not in another. And can you describe a little bit about why that might happen?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And again, there's providers that I trained under and gleaned from, and I'm like, wow, I'm so thankful for the wisdom that they shared in those years. Really what we did with this panel is kind of just took the way that I see it and kind of ordered it appropriately. So like, let's rule out this thing first. If this thing is not a big deal, then we move on to the next thing. So I'll kind of list them in that order.
That'd be great.
The first section looks at internal inflammation. So without going into too much of the nitty-gritty science, this is looking at the internal immune system and how an individual might be predisposed to having an increased aggressive inflammatory response. So a classic example of this is thinking about a brother-sister, right, who have generally some of the same genes, but they're going to have nuances in their genetic presentation. And let's say you have one kid who gets an illness and they spike super high fevers. They're on the couch for days at a time. They have difficulty recovering. And even what we meaning me and the pediatricians that I work with, will see maybe a pans panda-like type flare. If that person shows up as red on their internal inflammation on their NeuroWell Plus panel, that helps us understand that red, or what we call a homozygous mutation, is indicating that they may have, again, that aggressive inflammatory response.
Can I take us back for a second? Can you describe what homozygous mutation is?
Thank you. Okay. So thinking about kind of back to your days of biology, if you're in your genetics part of your biology class, right, you have a mom and a dad, whether that's a birth mom, birth dad, right? And that birth mom, birth dad passes down their genes. If someone has a mutation, or what we call a polymorphism, if they have a polymorphism on that gene for that specific purpose. So I'll just use a random example. Let's call it IL-5, interleukin 5. If a mom or a dad pass that down, if the mom and dad are both heterozygous, it shows up as yellow on our report, then the child that they create is going to be red. If the yellow and yellow, heterozygous makes a homozygous. Or, and you see me smiling here because this is where we get confusing, right? A mom could be red, homozygous. A dad could be green, wild type, no abnormality. And that passes down to a homozygous mutation. Or, right, you're kind of tracking with me, we could have green, which means, okay, the child is unaffected. And so this is kind of looking at genetics and how when we create a baby in utero, right, that baby has their genes dealt to them, but the environment affects the symptomology, if you will. I don't know if I'm going into too much detail. Does that kind of answer that question?
I think a lot of people that listen to this are kind of nerdy and like the details.
Okay, cool.
So,
I love it.
Yes.
I love it. Love it. Love it. Yep. So homozygous on our report shows up as red. And really the way I explain that to my clients is this does not mean it's life-threatening. This means it's more for us to pay attention to. So I kind of think about it like the stoplight, right? Like red is like, whoa, we've got a kid, going back to the example, a child who may have significant fevers, symptoms after a virus or after an infection. If they're red on that, to me, it's like, okay, this is a reason why we need to pay attention to that polymorphism and really address inflammation when there's an illness. Whereas you may have the brother or the sister who's yellow or green for that same polymorphism, same gene, I should say. And the parents may say they got the exact same sickness and they were up and off the couch, they were playing, there was no fever. Like, how do I make sense of that? And that's just an example to say, well, genes affect how our body responds to that illness. And so with precision, genomics or genetics, we could say, well, if the person has a significant flare in that red or that polymorphism, we may say we will need to be way more aware of or aggressive in using anti-inflammatory therapies, maybe things like omega-3s, palmettoethylenolamide or PEA, resveratrol. Some prescribing physicians will use low-dose naltrexone. Whereas if someone is mostly green in that whole section, we wouldn't really expect them to have an aggressive inflammatory response. And so we may say that's, not as important for people to be spending their time, money, and energy on. So again, it allows us to kind of create these priorities. So when people are scrolling through Instagram, that the influencer who says everybody needs to be fill in the blank, you can come at it with saying like, is that true of myself? Is that true of my child? So again, that first page, to summarize that first page on our report or the first panel on our report is looking at internal inflammatory markers. So these are the areas where we focus in on asthma, allergies, eosinophilia, eczema, chronic illnesses. If we've got a patient who presents with those things, I'm really looking at that part of the panel first, because to be quite honest, giving more vitamins and minerals, doing more therapies, doing more interventions may not actually stick or hold or affect the patient if we don't address that inflammation first.
Absolutely.
So that's a huge part, right?
Which actually then I think is a beautiful step, what you just said. Like adding more isn't always, often it's not helpful at all, but we can have this like more is better. And one approach or one aspect of your approach that I love is how you view things such as detoxification. And I will say, years ago, as I was learning things and reading books, and it seemed like methylated anything was the answer. So, you know what? I don't feel that great. How about if I add in some methylated bees? And goodness gracious, I had some strong reactions. So I'm very glad. Of course, I always have to personally do things, so I understand what it's like. But you have a strategy about improving methylation in the body. Can you talk about that as it relates to the detox pathways?
And let me give credit where credit is due, because when I say I have a strategy or you say I have a strategy, it definitely is something that I am adamant about. And it is something that I have learned. Paula Kripstead at Hope for Healing out in the Woodlands, I think was the first person I heard speak to this, and it resonated with what I have seen. Dr. Kendall Stewart is another person who speaks a lot to this idea of it may not actually really be this word of over methylation. So let's go with this. You have a person who says, you know what? I was tired. My child was lacking energy. They were inattentive. And so someone told me to start them on a methylated B complex. But when I did, they got agitated. They felt hyperactive. It was just worse. And so I Googled it and I realized that they're over methylating. What struck me when I heard, again, these experts in the field speak to it, as I was like, I've seen that happen. But now what we're acknowledging is the reality is there was probably inflammation that had not been addressed. That's the reason why we put it on the first page of our report. And if the inflammation is not addressed and you put in some really high quality methylated B vitamins, you are fueling a fire. So it's not that you can't tolerate those B vitamins necessarily, right? It's that there's something, and I usually come back to it is autophagy, which we'll speak to in a little while. It's usually autophagy and inflammation that have not been adequately supported. And so those nutrients, such as methylated B vitamins, are fueling the fire, not feeding the need. So again, first of all, what we do and what I've gleaned from the experts that I've followed is we have a solid month, sometimes even 2 months, if I suspect that there's some pretty chronic inflammation. We have a solid month or 2 months of addressing inflammation. So that looks first and foremost like we've got to do some work in changing up the diet to more of an anti-inflammatory way of eating. And sometimes that honestly can't happen first, which I'd love for it to. Sometimes we actually have to bring the inflammation down utilizing supplements to allow the body to then have the momentum, if you will, to change up the diet. But eventually an anti-inflammatory way of eating and an anti-inflammatory supplement regimen have to be on board for at least a month or 2 months. Then second, we have to think about what in the what we call the external inflammatory panel. It's kind of the second panel on our nutrigenomics testing. That external inflammatory panel is identifying these questions that everybody wonders. Am I sensitive to gluten? Do I have a dairy intolerance? I wonder if I'm histamine intolerant. Is there any sensitivity to mold, right? All those big questions that people wonder, we can actually look at genetically and figure out, is that contributing to the inflammation? So are there external things like gluten, dairy, mold, histamines? Are there external things that are causing more inflammation? And if there are, then we need to work on cleaning that part of the diet up.
And can I just say, it's so helpful to have this information because I knew, so when we use the test with one of my sons, I want everyone in my family to have it, but sometimes we just prioritize as need presents. And I knew for me, gluten is something that I'll just get sick. I love having gluten, but I get rashes, I get sick. So I just assumed, that would be the case. And then, of course, always just assuming let's cut dairy out because it's inflammatory. And there are times and places for that. But again, you need a lot of buy-in from everyone. So it was helpful to have on the panel to see that actually gluten wasn't a trigger for him. And then dairy, which again, I think there are reasons, glyphosate, all these other things that we want to be mindful of gluten. But I was surprised to see that dairy, it was going to be an issue in that if he was more inflamed, we didn't want it because he was then going to be more likely to get inflamed with it present in the diet. And then because mold is a big trigger for him, that if he's eating a cheese that has mold, that is it might not be the cheese, it's the mold in the cheese.
The mold that creates the cheese. Exactly. Yeah. And again, I am in this boat myself, right? As a mama of 4 children running a business. And I think when I meet with patients who the families would do anything, right? Like you've got someone who's coming with their child or someone who is coming for themselves that has a chronic illness, like they would do anything. I think we have to be careful as practitioners that we don't pounce on that unnecessarily, right? Like I want to make sure that for my patients, I'm saying, I know that people would do anything. And it is within my heart's desire to say, let's make sure that we don't overwhelm you with doing everything, right? Let's kind of pinpoint, like, where do we spend that momentum and that energy that you have for your child and say, you know what, it may be more here and less here. And so again, finding out those objective data points allows us to just say, you've got this energy, you've got this momentum, you've got this time, you've got this budget. Let's focus it here, maybe not so much here. So it allows for that. And again, just some of those questions, even as a dietitian for years, I'm like, I don't know. Does everybody need to, avoid? Or is there really a way that we can say, like, for this person, this will be a bigger impact. But for this person, I think we need to spend time and energy maybe on fill in the blank, detoxification, methylation, that sort of thing. And so that part of the panel, kind of on that external inflammatory, it allows us to answer some of those questions that have been lingering for people for a very long time. And then the third part of the panel, hinting at what you were mentioning earlier, we look at methylation. Methylation is a trigger word. It means so much more than just B vitamins, but that is the most popular way of methylation getting talked about. I mean, there are hundreds of biochemical reactions in the body that require this process called methylation. The one that gets the most notoriety is MTHFR, which is so important. Don't get me wrong.
I'm so glad you're touching on this.
I'm so glad that people are tuning into what's their MTHFR status. And again, many practitioners who are way smarter in the field of genetics than me would say, that's only one piece of the B vitamin puzzle, right? Folic acid to folate. MTHFR is one genetic enzyme that affects that conversion of folic acid to folate. But what happens if someone's green or normal on that MTHFR test, and then they assume like, okay, well, my brain's getting all the folate that it needs, when really there's other genetic enzymes that are involved in that pathway. And so one of the things we were really wanting to make sure that we did is included all of those other methylation pieces of folic acid to folate, including how things are catabolized, how things are remethylated, how homocysteine is involved. And so looking at all of those methylation pieces, once we've looked at the inflammation, now we can look at the methylation and say, all right, what do we need to do to support the fact that your brain needs B12 and folate? And this, really gets into where I'm passionate about the mental health. Someone who says, I've experienced anxiety or co-occurring diagnoses. Someone says, we've got this airway issue and a child is not sleeping well. So I don't know, is it the fact that they're not sleeping well, or is it the fact that they maybe don't have the folate and the neurotransmitters that come from folate to create attentiveness or to create a calm nervous system? And so it allows us to say, well, let's address both, right? Let's think about the airway, and let's also make sure that the brain has the nourishment that it needs by addressing folate and B12 and all the B vitamins that come with that.
Yes, all of them. Not just B12.
Not just B12, not just folate, right? Again, yes. I think about this word nourishment for the brain, and like nourishment is not just a thing. It's always a puzzle piece of things.
Absolutely.
The puzzle piece. And so that methylation part of the panel, again, it's the part people want to know the quickest and the fastest. Because
why do you think that is?
I think I'm thankful. I'm really, really thankful that it has probably been the most trendy thing. And I don't mean trendy in a bad way. I mean trendy in like it has trended in the functional space to get the most attention. And so I think people are like, I've heard about that. I want to know about that. There's probably a lot more research on that. And so I think people want to know, they're familiar with like a lack of folate creating neurochemical imbalances or creating fatigue, creating neural tube defects, like all those things people want to know. And so I think it's probably the most popular, but it has to be seen in the context of, again, the whole system. Yes. And I'll say this because you and I have chatted about this on the side. People investing money in a genetic test, it's a wise investment. At the same time, it does not mean that just because your genes say something that you have to do something about it, right? It doesn't mean just like, well, it's red, so I got to supplement with 16 different B vitamins, right? It means you need to be working with a clinician who is doing a symptom questionnaire and who is really looking at what is happening in this point in time and connecting that with your genes, not just saying, well, I paid for this really expensive genetic test and it says I need to take these 50 vitamins. So I'm going to do that from now until the day I'm no longer living. I'm like, yes, that's not actually how it should work. And so I would encourage people, that's not just me. There's so many amazing practitioners out there who are using genomics. Just make sure you find someone who's willing to run a test, but then also look at that test in light of your needs, your symptoms, and your goals for that time. Supplements should change over time, right?
Absolutely.
Those things should change over time. So again, I know it's kind of an outlier.
Wait, say why. Why
Yeah,
should
well,
they
they change
change?
over time, right? Well, first of all, like deficiencies change over time. So just because someone has a genetic mutation or just because someone has a deficiency or a polymorphism, more correct, in a methylation part of their panel doesn't necessarily mean that they're always going to be deficient in folate.
There you
I've
go.
heard that said, right? Like you're going to need folate for the rest of your life. And I may have even said that, when I was early on in my training. But what I now know is there are times in an individual's life where there's going to be way more demand on your genes, right? Way more demand on that system. So thinking about puberty, prepubescence,
Which I
pregnancy.
love. That is something you point out on the panel.
Yeah.
Again, just seeing lots of patients that have gone through this panel, and then, like I said, family members that have gone through it, and seeing, oh, some of these things we don't necessarily need to be considering this supplement or this medication right now, but once we hit puberty, then we might.
We might, right?
Can you speak to that?
Yeah, yeah. And puberty is one of those things where I would say once we hit a time of increased demand, we could kind of maybe widen that need and say there's a time of increased demand. So prepubescence, and again, I think about not just puberty. This is where the pediatricians who I work alongside can speak way more into the whys. But, prepubescence, puberty, pregnancy, high stress, high demand at work, like those are times where there's an increased demand on the body, whether that's to create a hormone cascade to begin development, right? Or whether that is to create a baby, or whether that is to support a baby during the years of breastfeeding, or whether that is in perimenopause or menopause, right? Or whether that's like you're going through a really difficult thing in life, like there's extra demands. I just always think like there are times where more is needed, and there are times where more is not better. It's just more. Right. My favorite line in the old Sabrina, right? It's more is not always better. It's sometimes just more.
With the accent.
Yes. Audrey Hepburn.
I know. So good. Okay. So I want to walk all the way through the panel, because even guys, if you don't do the panel, I think there is just foundational information about health and, like you said, longevity that is contained in these systems. And I love how you're breaking it down. So keep
Absolutely.
going.
Yeah. And so that people know my cards are on the table. This is not a pitch for the panel. This is an educational piece of like how to understand nutrigenomics, right? So that's kind of our heartbeat in sharing all these things. So that methylation, then that methylation, as I mentioned earlier, we look at autophagy and neurotrophic factors. So for those listening that think I just mispronounced autophagy, it could be autophagy, it could be autophagy, depends upon what part of the country you're from. So autophagy or autophagy, this is a fancy word that is referencing cellular degradation and recycling. So we think about these cells that we have in our body. Those cells have a lifespan. When they have done their job, they're supposed to die off, turn over, and replace themselves. If
supposed to being the key word. Right? Yes.
If any part of that autophagy or autophagy system is inefficient, it means we can see increased cellular aging. In kiddos, we can see the onset of developmental or neurodevelopmental disorders. It's not the reason, but it can be a part of the reason.
Can you speak to why?
Yeah. So thinking about, again, just kind of the basics of thinking about cellular turnover, right? If we don't have, again, I'm just really creating baseline on this. If we don't have turnover in cellular health, we don't have new cells developing to do what they need to do efficiently. The other thing, and I see this clinically, even in the youngest of kiddos that I work with, when we have poor autophagy, we have poor blood sugar regulation. That doesn't mean prediabetes or diabetes necessarily, although that is a part of autophagy long-term if left unaddressed. But in the earliest years, in the pediatric years, what I see in my clients is the mom or the dad who says, oh my goodness, they get hangry, right? Like we see irritability, aggression, impulsivity and my question is always, does it increase? Do those symptoms increase if it's been longer than 3 to 4 hours since they've had something to eat, specifically something with protein? And if the mom and dad think for a little while and they're like, yeah, or the adult patient thinks for a little while and they're like, yeah, I'm like, hey, that's a sign of that autophagy marker that we saw on your panel, that's a sign that it is it's flaring in these moments because we have this dip in the blood sugar, which creates a storm, right? Of like the body, the insulin receptors can be desensitized. The body is not getting the nourishment it needs to that brain. And so all of a sudden we see those elements, right? Of irritability, impulsivity, aggression. Again, it's not the reason, but it is often a part of the reasons. And so I see that with kiddos. So the most important thing that I see in the kiddos that I work with is just thinking about that autophagy marker really creating those swings in blood sugar. And so when we can support that, and what I mean by support that, D-chiroinositol is a very safe, might be helpful, not harmful kind of thing that we try. And when there's a polymorphism in that category, we also say, hey, high protein, right? High protein, healthy fat. It doesn't mean a child or an adult has to be ketogenic. I just mean I want you to emphasize a healthy portion of protein and a healthy fat every 3 to 4 hours for this person, right? So, and then exercise is another way that we use. Again, we use epigenetics to address the genetics. And so those 3 things can be really critical, not critical, life-threatening, but critical in importance for helping someone say, okay, maybe it's not just about taking a cajillion supplements. Maybe it's making sure that I set a timer to fuel my body or my child's body on a schedule to create some regulation in that autophagy system. And here's something that you and I both are believers in: rest and digest.
There you go.
We don't have to call that intermittent fasting. It can be, right? But in the youngest of children that I work with, sometimes the biggest influence that we can make on the GI system and the autophagy system is saying, hey, there is a time where we say kitchen closed, right? So we eat dinner, we do whatever we're going to do after dinner, and 6:30, 7 p.m., kitchen closed, brush the teeth, we're getting ready for bed, we're focusing in on relationships and family. And then from 6:30 to 6:30 or 7 to 7, there's 12 hours that we say that is a gift to the body to allow it to do its work of cleaning up cellular debris, of allowing the GI system to rest. And there are some pretty amazing things that happen just from this idea of, when the sun goes down, we stop eating and we allow our body to rest, digest, and regenerate, right? When the sun comes up, we nourish our body and we start eating again. Again, it's one of those things where it's like, it's low-hanging fruit. It doesn't cost anything, but it can make such an impact, again, in that autophagy world.
I want to share something that has been amazing for me. And honestly, I think it could be for you too. If you've been around for a while, you know I have ADHD, and finding ways to support my focus and mental clarity is non-negotiable. That's why I'm obsessed with Danger Coffee. Unlike regular coffee that sometimes leaves me foggy and jittery, Danger Coffee is tested and proven mold-free. That means no hidden toxins hijacking my brain power. Instead, I get the clean energy boost I need without the crash. But here's the kicker. It's more than just a clean coffee. Danger Coffee is electrolyte rich, which means it supports my adrenal health instead of depleting it. Plus, it's remineralized, which supports cellular function and even the mineral density of our teeth. As a myofunctional therapist, you know I'm always thinking about oral health. Minerals are key to keeping our teeth strong. So, if you're looking for a coffee upgrade, give Danger Coffee a try. And because you're part of the MyoHacker community, you can save 10% with the code MyoHacker. Just head on over to dangercoffee.com and use the code MyoHacker at checkout. Try it out and let me know if you feel the danger edge. I love that. No, I just wanted to speak to, I personally have tried to get away from fasting so many times because I love eating whenever I want. And when I don't do a minimum of 12 hours of fasting, my body, I'm like a little canary that I'm going to flare and tell everybody something's wrong. I get sick, and it's unfortunate and I know we won't even go down this road, but I'll just say there are going to be genetically possibly people that wouldn't benefit as much from that. But personally, and it could be also because of my GI history and all of those things, that my body truly needs a lot of repair time.
Yeah.
And it's like, and maybe it's my ADHD. It's like, we want to do all the things. And if we're if we're eating, we're not repairing. And it truly is a system switch.
Yeah.
So,
and again, you heard my phrase, like resting and digesting, because I think the idea of intermittent fasting needs to be so individualized and work with a practitioner. Like you said, there are some people that would say, I can't. There's a whole host of reasons why I can't. And we work with that. But 12 hours to me, if someone is unable to go 12 hours without eating, that actually says something to me about where we need to support the body, right? Because someone having a dip in blood sugar or a craving or a need for food during a 12-hour window, usually there's something else going on, right? There may be spikes in hormones. There may be sleep hygiene that needs to be addressed first. So like we need to go to bed, right? We need to get you in bed earlier. There may be other things, but we call 12 hours rest and digest. I don't even call that intermittent fasting. To me, that is resting and digesting. And so again, like that may be something for folks to hear and be like, why can I not go 12 hours? Right? What's going on there, and where do I get support there? But that autophagy piece it's a very short panel in our nutrigenomic panel, but it is a very important one, as you hear, with just the amount of time I've spent talking about it. And then the next part we get to, which I know you and I are passionate about. Again, what are we not passionate about?
Right. Yes. This is why we're friends.
But passionate about this detoxification.
Yes.
So again, if we want to talk about a word, especially in the month of January, that is so emphasized, right? Detox, detox, detox. Mm-hmm. What does that mean, right? Like, is that a pill someone takes? Is that a diet someone is doing? In my world, detoxification is looking at the systems, I believe, by God's good design that have been put into our bodies to help our bodies be able to offload the burdens that maybe we weren't ever supposed to take in, right? So in the big extreme senses, these are folks who work in the oil and gas industry that are exposed to compounds, chemicals all day, every day. We got to make sure that their detox systems are upregulated, functioning appropriately, just to help them do the jobs that they do.
You know, my dad, his background was oil and gas, and he told me this story about how, I mean, he was in his early 20s. He was playing with mercury on his hands just because it was fun. It was cool. And they were just playing. I'm like,
we know better now, right?
Yes,
we know better, we do better, right? Yes. We know better, we do better, right? And,
yes.
And please know, you know this. I want listeners to know it is never my intention to evoke fear. I should have probably started with that, right? So what I want folks to know as they're hearing this is, okay, so let's say someone runs a panel, or they just know this about themselves. They know that they have a sluggish detoxification system for whatever reason. There is nothing to fear. There is information that you now have to say, okay, how do I first and foremost, before we ever talk about taking supplements or sitting in saunas or ... right? First and foremost, the biggest change someone can make for their overall body burden is thinking about what are they putting into and on their body that may be contributing to that body burden. So again, we can have a whole podcast. I'm sure you will someday.
We probably should. We should probably have a follow-up.
I can point you to some of the best people of like thinking about your skin as your largest organ, right? And so what are you putting onto your body when it comes to products and cosmetics and fragrances, right? And then number two, what are you utilizing in your home? And I know I sound a little crunchy when I say this. I know it can be
Please do. Sound crunchy. I want it.
It can be so daunting, right? And I work with my clients in saying, let's take just one step at a time. Let's look at low-hanging fruit and saying, what is one thing we can do in this world, right? Of reducing body burden. So it can be overwhelming, and I don't think people need to do it all at one time, but it can be as simple as saying, hey.
Let's just say sometimes detoxing too fast.
Oh, yes.
Can be very harmful.
Which is why.
Please don't do it all at once.
If I had my preference, what I tell people is like, let's focus on reducing the body burden, because I've never seen a detox reaction from saying, hey, put less of that bad stuff in. And what I mean by bad stuff, that's a trigger word. Bad stuff. What I mean by that is the burdens on our system, right? So yes, processed foods, right? And junk food, but also fragrances and chemicals and what we clean our home with. Like, I've never seen someone have a poor detox reaction from saying, I'm going to change what I clean with. I'm going to change what I put on my lips. I'm going to change my perfume. Nobody ever has a bad detox reaction from that. So if we can change the body burden, that is so key, right? And there are some great companies out there. I don't have any affiliation with them, so I'll give a shout out to Branch Basics, right? I think that their education and reducing that immune burden is amazing, right? Primally Pure. Companies like this are doing a really great job of educating first and providing products that obviously, support the knowledge. And then when we're reducing that body burden, then we think about, all right, well, what if someone has that body burden already? What do we do to appropriately support that? And we can talk about fancy detox kits or supplements, but I first, maybe I should say second, would say, what are you eating that has natural detoxification properties? So things like cruciferous vegetables, right? Broccoli, kale, cabbage, Brussels sprouts, right? All those cruciferous vegetables, onions, garlic, those things, those are mandates in what we need to be working into our daily regimen. And then I also emphasize, like, are you having a bowel movement every day? And I know it's not cool to talk about, but
we celebrate it in our house. We truly, I want my boys to know it is important. We prioritize it, and I never want shame around it. And so we make a big deal. Yes, people are a little weirded out if they come over, but you know what? My boys are little. It's okay. So
celebrate it.
Yes.
Well, and again, thinking about, my kids learn like the digestive system in kindergarten in their school curriculum, right? And I'm like, all right, your digestive system, so eliminating with a bowel movement, eliminating with urine, and eliminating via sweat. Like, these are 3 God-given designs of our body to say you're gonna detox well as long as you're doing those things well. So it means you need to be having a daily bowel movement and get support in doing that if you're not already. It means you need to be drinking plenty of non-caffeinated fluids. There's no point in taking fancy detox supplements if you're not drinking enough water, right, to get it out through the kidneys. And then number 3, you need to be sweating. And that could be an infrared sauna. I'm a huge fan of low EMF infrared saunas, but it also could just be, hey, we live in a climate where you're sweating all the time if you just walk outside. And so just
if you walk outside, if you're inside, it's air conditioned.
If you get outdoors.
Yeah.
Right. And so sweating, having a bowel movement, drinking appropriate fluids, eating those cruciferous veggies, like, those are not trendy detox regimens, but they are basics that I would say if we're not focusing on those things, we really don't have any business doing detox protocols that have like fancy pills. Now, that being said, once someone is covering all those basics, I do think there is a nutritional space that we focus in on things like glutathione, right? And speak into those polymorphisms we might see show up on a nutrigenomics test and say, hey, this person may have a difficult time offloading because they may have a difficult time assimilating and utilizing that glutathione. And so maybe this is a person that they would need that in specific situations. And you and I have chatted about post-op or pre-op, really, I would say pre-op. There are times when I would say, hey, we need to do a 2-week preparation utilizing a liposomal or transdermal glutathione, getting that into the body, making sure that with both supporting methylation and supporting detoxification, even the most sensitive individuals on their nutrigenomics, they can tolerate anesthesia. I'll throw myself out there as just a case study. I had a 5-hour, 3 surgeries at one time, 5-hour procedure. I was under anesthesia. If you could see my genomics, you would know if I wouldn't have been supporting my body, I think I would have had a really difficult time being under anesthesia that long, if not maybe a really difficult time coming out.
There you go.
And the nurses and the doctors all kind of giggled when I came out of anesthesia like this. I was clear-headed, totally fine, not groggy. And that's not because I'm a superhero. It's because I think we have this information where I'd been doing these things for months/years. And so again, just case study of one. But I think that's an appropriate time where we say, okay, do all those basic things. And if there's going to be an intervention, a surgical procedure, maybe we support your body extra if needed with those glutathione and extra detox support. And believe it or not, we're almost through all the panels.
I love that you're breaking it down just step by step. And guys, I will encourage you to look at the show notes for this episode so you can get, okay, what are those big areas that Danielle discussed? And, this is a lot of information. It's okay to take a step back and then just go, okay, what did she bullet point? Let's go through that. But we want you to have this information because I think we had to dig and sift and do so much over the past few years just to learn and see how can we help our patients the most. And so we want you to have this information. So are there any other panels on it?
Yeah, actually 2 more. And I'll just say quickly so I don't forget, for practitioners who, or for patients who say, look, I already have an existing practitioner. I'm established my care. I'm like, by all means, send this to them, right? That we have a 1 hour, it is literally 60 minutes, an onboarding training for practitioners who are looking to utilize this panel. And my hope in doing that was to say, hey, it took me so long to have to figure all this out. Again, there's some way smarter people than me who I gleaned all this from, and just kind of taking wisdom, experience, even just some strategies from pediatric care in my own family. We wanted to create a 1 hour course when another practitioner could say, I want to start offering this to my patients. So if you're a practitioner, reach out, and ask about that. Or if you're a patient who says, I want to do this, but I want to do it with my practitioner, I'm like, awesome. Tell them, to reach out to me, and we can always help get them onboarded and trained in that. But the last 2 panels, to kind of go to a summary as far as what we're looking at, the last 2 emphasis that we think about is mitochondrial health, and then what we call other health precautions. So mitochondrial health, everybody say it with me, the mitochondria are the powerhouse of the cells, right?
Yes.
We know that, but what does that mean, right? Like, what does that mean? Mitochondria are the powerhouse of the cells. There are some amazing researchers that are looking at mitochondrial dysfunction, like specifically genetically, when mitochondria are affected and they're not allowed to be the most powerful powerhouses of the cells, if you will. What implications does that have? And again, amazing researchers that are even looking into autism spectrum, like how is mitochondrial dysfunction, things like multiple sclerosis, neurodegenerative conditions. I could go on. But when we look at that mitochondrial marker part of the panel, that then opens my eyes to what we can do nutritionally to support someone's mitochondria. CoQ10 is probably the thing that gets the most notoriety, L-carnitine. Again, thinking about this idea of, I want to support my mitochondria, even in the biohacking world, right? I want to support my mitochondria. I would say, yes, but make sure you know what your mitochondria are asking for. And so when I am looking at that part of the panel, it helps me differentiate, does a child just need to be on a multivitamin, or do they maybe need to be on a multivitamin, multimineral that contains mitochondrial support? So, you and I've chatted about different brands or products that we'll use. Again, some of those would just have multivitamin, multiminerals, versus other ones will have multivitamin, multimineral support to kind of act as a safety net, but then would also have amino acids and CoQ10 to make sure that we are nourishing those mitochondria. And then finally, the very last part of the panel, we just call it other health markers, because they are these kind of standalone markers that show vitamin D assimilation. If someone says, I've always had low vitamin D, I'm not sure what that's about. That's genetic. It's not just that you're not getting out in the sun enough or not taking enough. If it's a consistently low vitamin D when you are exposed to sunshine and when you are taking low doses of vitamin D, it actually can be an assimilation problem. You may also need some vitamin K with that. And then other parts of that puzzle show a clotting factor, which again, I don't manage, but I hand off to my patients to say, hey, this is good to know. If you're going into surgery and you have difficulty clotting, your doctor may want to know this. Or things like thyroid health. cholesterol management, and blood pressure. So these are one-off markers that we as a practice don't necessarily manage for our patients, but we make sure we clearly say, hey, these are pieces of your nutrigenomics that we want you to take back to your primary care or your specialist and make sure that they know this about you. Even one about hormones and estrogen conversion, saying, hey, I'm not going to manage those hormones, but if you're ever thinking about being on a birth control or a bioidentical hormone, this is really important for your prescribing physician to know. So again, that back part is not something that we necessarily prescribe or manage or supplement accordingly. It's just something that we try to be part of that multidisciplinary team and making sure that they have that information to help the patient get the right treatment.
Absolutely.
Man, that was a lot. That was a lot.
That's the thing. Our health is a lot.
Lot.
This is why it is easier to just go into autopilot and not address things. Because when we see that, okay, we have a body that is made up of systems and systems interact and they affect each other, we can shut down. So I want you to put your counselor hat on and speak to the parents or even the practitioners that are listening and ready to turn this off because they feel overwhelmed with just too much information. What would you say to them? And what is one thing that they can do?
Yeah, which is so funny. I'm going to answer your question. When you say put my counselor hat on, it just reminded me, I'm like, the neurotransmitters. There's a whole section, there's a whole panel that I skipped over that's all about neurotransmitters. And that is where I put my counselor hat on the most and say, looking at nutrigenomics, when someone has been on and off of psychiatric meds or is considering, I'm not anti-med by any means. I think it is wise for us to consider what may be contributing to mental health burden, right? And so that neurotransmitter part of the panel is pretty key when we're looking at that. And so now to put my counselor hat really on, your question was, what would I say to those parents who are
Which this is what you say. In sessions, you have said this with me. I know you have said this with so many of my patients. They come to you and just finding out this information on a cursory level, and even just a consult, it's overwhelming to consider nutrition, to consider environment, because we have to work very, very hard to not eat terrible things and not be just immersed in terrible chemicals and light and EMFs. So speak to the overwhelm.
Yeah. So on one hand, objective data can be validating, which can be comforting. And so I want to be honest, I've had multiple panels that I've run on someone where we say at the end of the day, like, let's just pause on the, like, what do we do about it? And let's just take a moment to use this test as validation for, like, you're not crazy, or you don't need to be, emphasizing that. Let's just use it as a time of validation of, like, your child or your body really does need support in this way. So sometimes that brings tears to people's eyes of just like, I just needed to know that it is, right? Beyond that, when the overwhelmingness sets in, I always self-disclose to folks that the first time I saw my kids' nutrigenomics panels, even with this being part of my job, I was overwhelmed. And so if a practitioner in this field can be overwhelmed, then I want families and moms and dads to know, like, we don't create change. This is the counselor hat, right? We don't create change from a place of anxiety. There's something called productive anxiety where we say, okay, I'm feeling momentum and motivation from what I just learned, but someone will never create long-standing, long-lasting change from a place of anxiety or fear. And so the question that I like to ask as I'm working with clients, and I think it's good for everyone to consider, is what part of this keeps me in a place of productive anxiety and not destructive anxiety, right? So which part of this knowledge that I just gleaned creates momentum, creates motivation, creates excitement of even like, I'm ready to do that? That is where you focus in on.
Yes.
If there is a whole nother part of things that says, I am so scared and I've got to do this now, that would actually not be where I tell people to start. Because to be quite honest, like, your kids are going to pick up on that. And they're going to pick up on the fear and the anxiety, and nobody is going to benefit, right? And so I think again, I say we, meaning the practitioner that you work with, or someone who's reading their test results for themselves or thinking about all these things, might want to say, all right, what did I hear in that podcast today that I thought, ooh, I want to look into that, or I want to think about that. That is where you need to run. Yes. Right? Not into the like, oh, I'm scared. What if this is true? And again, that's just the counselor in me, but it's also the human in me that says, like, I know I have seen those things in my family to be way more effective when mom, dad, and kids were all like, we're going to do this and we're going to do this together. We're not going to do it out of fear. We're not going to do it out of this place of like, call it what you want to, idolatry, or, being like so unreachable that you can't hang out with friends ever. Right? I think we have to consider that a person needs to be seen as a biopsychosocial spiritual being. And that sounds real clever, but what I mean by that is there are biological things, right? There are psychological things, biopsychosocial. There's a relational component, biopsychosocial, spiritual, right? For those who have a willingness to engage that part of themselves, like, we have to think about that whole person. And if one is suffering, then they're not all going to flourish at the same time. So an example I would use of that is if someone says, we have to eat so clean that I'm cooking every meal at home and my child can never eat out, there's a relational or social aspect that is missing, right? Absolutely. Or if we're never addressing the diet and we're only dependent on taking supplements to address the biology, right, then there's pieces that are missing. So I don't know if that's long-winded. It is long-winded.
But it's beautiful.
Oh, I want people to know that it's complex and it's overwhelming, because it should be something that we consider daily, right? Like, what does this look like today? Today may be a day where, like, I need to nourish my body's relational needs or my kids' relational needs. Tomorrow may be a day where we need to rein it in and we need to really nourish that biological need because everybody's got a stuffy nose. But I think when we get backed into a corner of thinking about it's just this one thing, I think other aspects of our whole being suffer, right? Like kind of our God-given design suffers. So that's what I want to open people up to, is like, be okay with it not being 100% of the time.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. And that's even I would say I have seen some patients who have gone through the panel. This has even been my own experience, is that we've sort of taken care of acute things are on fire. And then we, for cost and just priority and time and attention purposes, maybe toggle back a little bit. And that can be, I'm not recommending that, but I just think it's important to know that you can have a little bit of a give and this flow with learning these things, incorporating them, and that sometimes these little, not breaks, but just putting a little bit less gas, or, you're not going full throttle with incorporating everything all at once, but just trying one thing, breathing, connecting, how much it can help to integrate what you are working on.
Absolutely. And I mean, again, I'm assuming that we're talking to a lot of parents.
Yes.
Or that there are a lot of parents listening in. When I think about, like, part of our goal here is not just to gift wellness to your child, it's to gift the love of wellness, right? The experience of how do I care well for my body. And so I'm always thinking about that with my kids, of like, I could be hardcore about a lot of things and get them really healthy. But what happens when they're 18 and I'm not doing it for them? Right? Like, my bigger challenge is not just to, quote, get them healthy. Now it is really to create an environment where they're learning how to balance all of their needs of health and wellness. And so we have to model that even in the way that we live it as parents, as adults, right? But also in the way that we demand it from our kids, right? Like, sometimes it is today's just a day where we're going to take our shoes off and go hang out in the grass instead of trying to eat that applesauce with all those supplements in it.
Yeah.
right? Like, there has to be flexibility in our thinking. That would be the biggest thing I would say as a counselor, right? Is there has to be flexibility.
Just as a parent.
As a parent.
We have to have flexibility in thinking. And yes. So how can people connect with you? Where can they go?
They can, I'm laughing because I manage our social media. So sometimes there's a whole lot of posts and sometimes there's not. But you can find stories on all of the things we've talked about today: nutrigenomics, testing, the practitioner training. Those are all on our Facebook and Instagram pages at the Cognizant Group, THE, Cognizant Group. Make sure you put the "the" in front. People can also reach out to us. If you don't have an existing provider, first of all, I'm a huge believer in stick with who you've got, right? Try to make it work with who you've got.
Yes.
But if someone doesn't have an existing provider and they're interested in utilizing our services at the Cognizant Group, the best way to do that is actually to book an appointment or book a consult online, which is the Cognizant Group. And those are the two best ways, to access us. And we're happy to answer questions, for things that come up. We realize there's other people in this space that are doing fabulous work. And so if we're not the right fit for someone, we have awesome referrals to make sure we get them connected with someone who is.
And I just want to highlight that Danielle, and it's not just you now at the Cognizant Group. Well, we have had Brian there, but now you have another clinician.
Yes, Kristen Britt is an LPC who does EMDR. She'll be coming back from maternity leave in the end of February.
Which is just fabulous. So I want to encourage you, if you're listening, to reach out and book that appointment. Also, if you're a clinician and you want to get that training, I will have the link for the NeuroWell Plus panel training. We'll put that in there so you guys can get that training. And truly, I would love to hear from you. If you go through the training, please let me know, because Danielle gets full and I need to be able to refer to people that are trained in the NeuroWell panel. So please let me know. Just reach out. You can send me a DM.
It's beyond me just getting full. I think there is such a gift to patients for a practitioner in a specific area. For example, OB-GYNs who are caring for mamas and babies in utero, to know this information with the expertise that they come at it from, right? Or pediatricians, psychiatrists. We have a couple psychiatrists that are using it. I'm like, they have prescriptions and expertise and knowledge that I do not have. And so sometimes it's not even just that I'm full. It's that really these practitioners that are in these specialty areas can provide even more, nuances to how these things play out.
So everyone take a deep breath. And like I said, refer to the show notes. I'm so glad that we could have Danielle here with the Cognizant Group. Send us your questions. I would love to hear your feedback. And of course, please share this podcast with someone you love, someone you know, someone that you think they need to hear this information. Please share it. That is how we get the word out about this life-changing information. So thank you, as always, for your time. We just value it so much, and we hope that you have an amazing day. I hope you have enjoyed this episode of the MyoHacker podcast. Remember, small changes can make big impacts on our overall health and well-being. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to rate and review wherever you get your podcasts. This way, more families will learn about this important information, and we can make a bigger impact. Head on over to myohackerslp.com for in-depth resources and guides. You can also join me on Instagram at MyoHackerSLP for bonus content and demos. And if you have questions or topic suggestions for future episodes, send me a message. I would love to hear from you. Until next time, let's biohack myofunctional health as MyoHackers who change the world through intentional action and connection and breathing. Quick disclaimer reminder. The content shared in this podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only.